Let's see. There. All right. This is the talk I gave yesterday to a conference on Greece held at the Webster University here in Vienna, and I want to just give a better copy of that for placing on the web using my own technology to record it. So let's go. So, of course, you all know I'm running a Patreon campaign these days to become crowd-funded. I'm still teaching at Kingston for the next year, but I'll be an independent academic from that point on, and I want to be able to continue doing what I'm doing in the public without having to put up with the constrictions of the university system, which have become completely dominated by bureaucrats. So I've had enough of it. I'm going to become an independent scholar, and Patreon is helping me doing that. Now, to raise an issue about what's happening in Greece these days under the auspices of the European Union and its policy, which is fundamentally imposing austerity on the economy so that they can save money and repair their balance sheets, etc., etc. I'm leaving out whether that's actually feasible. That's, of course, a topic very well explored by Yanis Varoufakis in his book that I highly recommend to read. It's not just a good discussion of the economics of the whole thing. It's a ripping yarn, adults in the room, and I'm using that as a bit of a cover here. Apparently that phrase was said by Christine Lagarde in describing the behaviour of the finance ministers at one stage in one of the meetings that Yanis is part of. I haven't got that part of the book, and I'm looking forward to reading that. As I said, I've enjoyed reading the remainder very, very much so. But I think rather than having adults in the room, what we really have is children in charge, and I want to show why that's the case. I'm not calling the individual finance ministers children, but I'm saying they're believing in a childish theory of how the economy operates, and I want to illustrate that with a very simple example of a little kingdom I've made up that I call TomDickHaria, which is like an anagram in some ways for the European Union. And if you look at what the finance ministers are implementing, the policies that the European Union is following, they really flow from the so-called Stability and Growth Pact, which was signed back in Amsterdam in 1997. And one of the key parts of that is that the member states undertake to abide by the medium-term budgetary objective of positions close to balance or in surplus. So this is being seen as responsible finance, sound finance. You're all going to make sure that you, at least, if at the worst you spend what you earn, at best you spend less than you earn, which is the Schwabian housewife's idea of how to run a national economy. So let's take a look at how that works out. So we have the union of Tom, Dick and Harrier, and they've each agreed to spend no worse than run a budget balance, certainly to avoid running a deficit. The objective is to run a surplus. So they each start with 100 euros. The total money supply is 300 euros. And initially, each is spending $100 per year on each of the other two. So total expenditure by Tom, by Dick and by Harry is 200 euros per year on a cash level initially of 100 euros. So the idea here is that the money is turning over twice a year, which is not an unrealistic figure. When the velocity of money was measured in America in particular between 1950 and about 1980, that velocity was between 2 and 4 times per annum. So 2 is not a bad number to start with. So we lay this out in an expenditure and income table, and what you have there is the spending by Tom, by Dick and by Harry. On the diagonal you see the amount being spent, and on the off diagonal you see where that money is being spent. So Tom is spending, just to highlight that here, Tom is spending $200 per year, $100 of that is going to Dick, $100 going to Harry. Of course that row sums to 0, and the same applies to each of the other rows. So that's the expenditure, in this case by Dick, 100 goes on Harry, 100 goes on Tom. Necessarily that totals to 0. And the same for Harry. So if you look at then at what their savings are, the aggregate savings in each case is 0. So they start running off a balanced budget. Expenditure is equal to income for each of them in the individual as well as in the aggregate. So that's our starting point. Aggregate expenditure of 600 euro per year, aggregate income of 600 euro per year, 0 savings. And expenditure is income. This is an incontrovertible rule of macroeconomics. But let's see what the implications are of that when you attempt to run a budget surplus in that situation. So Kingdom of Tom is the first one to try to go for it, and he aims for a budget surplus of 5% of his GDP per year, which is 200 euros per year, so 5% of that is 10 euros. So his objective is to run a surplus this year of 10 euros. So of course that what he means is he's now, rather than spending 200 euros, he spends 190 euros, which means he's going to spend 95 on Dick and 95 on Harry. And that means that if he does that, while they continue spending the 200 euros per year they started spending, then his expenditure is 190, but his income is 200, and therefore he saves 10. So that's looking really, really good for Tom. Trouble is, he's spending 95 rather than 100 on Dick, and you look at the sum, you find that Dick is now running a budget deficit of €5, and so is Harry. So in this situation, yes, Tom has achieved a surplus, and the aggregate GDP has now fallen. If you now sum up these rows, 190 plus 200 plus 200, you get 590. Exactly the same sum applies if you add up the off-diagonal elements, of course, because expenditure is income. So Tom's budget surplus has caused an identical fall in GDP. Okay, this is the problem with applying the Schwabian housewives thinking at the aggregate level. So there's been and this is not an accident, this is directly causal. Tom's attempt to save money has turned up as a fall in income at the aggregate level. That doesn't happen to the individual, but it does happen to a macroeconomy. So the savings cause an equal fall in GDP. And notice the aggregate savings, they are 0. Okay. Now, let's say counting Dick and Harry, having found themselves being thrown into deficit, whether they know this or not, by the actions of Tom, they decide they're going to cut their spending by that €5 each year to restore themselves to balance. So what happens when they do that? Well, that now means that rather than spending 200, they're going to spend 195 each, and they distribute that equally, by spending less on Dick, spends that much less on Harry, and that much less on Tom. Oh, and what happens is, well, not quite perfection, because they managed to reduce their budget deficit now, but only by half as much as they tried to do. And by doing so, they've also reduced the budget surplus that Tom was running. So we now have, notice again, aggregate GDP has fallen yet again. We've now gone from 590 to 580 as an aggregate GDP. So there's been a €10 fall in GDP, precisely equal to the savings that Tom and Dick intended to cause for themselves. And now all three are failing to meet their savings targets. And aggregate savings is still 0. So Tom decides he's going to overshoot. He's going to aim for €10 less again this year. And Dick and Harry try to also reach a halfway point. They repeat their €5 reduction again because they didn't get there last time. So now what we find is Tom is now spending 180, which means he's spending 90 on each of Dick and Harry. And Dick and Harry are spending 190 each, 95 on each of the other two. And luckily, here we go, Tom has got back to his intended surplus of 10, but Dick and Harry are back in exactly the same situation again as they were when Tom first started to saving. They're now running deficits. So what's our situation now? Well, Tom's restored his surplus. He's got that €10. Aggregate GDP has fallen again. It's now down by €20. So we've gone from 600 to €560 in aggregate GDP. So savings by all three causes an equal fall in GDP. An attempt to save at the individual level causes a fall in income at the aggregate level, precisely the same amount, and aggregate savings are still 0. So now Dick and Harry decide they've really got to push things. They're going to aim to cut their spending by another €10 a year to try to restore balance. What happens there? Well, now we have all three spending 180, meaning they're spending 90 on each other, and we're back to balance again. Wonderful. So Tom's surplus has been eliminated. Aggregate GDP has now fallen to €540. So the €20 fall in GDP is again caused by the savings that Dick and Harry decide to execute. Savings at the individual level causes a fall in income at the aggregate level. Aggregate savings remain at 0. This is the fallacy of applying the Schwabian housewife vision to running a national economy. Now, if Tom decides to reserve his surplus, what happens? I don't need to repeat this, I hope. The end result of this process of all these countries trying to achieve a surplus is a GDP of 0. That's the fatal flaw in the European Union's policies, and it's obvious when you just show it in this attempt to show the aggregate together rather than thinking about your own individual economies. So economies and unions of economies cannot save money. The whole idea that saving is possible at the national level is a fallacy. If we're going to increase the amount of money we accumulate in our bank accounts, that requires the production of money. And this is the issue again that frankly, Wolfgang Schäuble is totally ignorant about, and this ignorance is what's driving the childish behaviour of the European Union that's driving it into a black hole. You have to ask who produces money. Now there's three answers to that. Countries can produce money by exporting more than they import, because when that happens, if Mercedes sells a Mercedes-Benz vehicle in the UK, they get English pounds for it. The English pounds are brought back by Mercedes-Benz back to Germany. They're presented to their bank. The bank takes them to the European Central Bank, deposits them with the central bank in pounds. They get euros credited to their account. That's a way, effectively, that exports produce for Europe. They produce euros. So the trade surplus is converted into domestic currency by the central bank, whichever country you're looking at, and in that case the only sustainable basis for the EU's objectives of surpluses is mercantilism. Now, I thought they were against that, but that's the only way you can achieve their objectives. The other two ways you can create money are banks create money by creating more debt than is repaid. And that is what I call bank-originated money and debt, or bond. That creates money, but it creates debt at the same time. So the net asset position of the borrower does not change. They get an increase in their liabilities, which is the debt they owe the bank. They get an increase in their assets, which is the cash created by the bank, but the net sum increase there is zero. So it comes with bank money comes with an identical debt liability for the recipient. The third way you can create money is by governments, financed by their central banks, spending more than they get back in tax. Now, this is what the European Union is dedicated not to allowing to happen. But this is therefore saying they want to prevent the government sector from creating money, and they prefer it if the government sector actually destroyed money. That is not sensible economics. It's childish. And that's the problem we have in the global economy, that people believe this nonsense and are putting it into practice in government policy, particularly in the European Union. Now, a government deficit, when the money that is generated by that deficit creates liability-free money for the recipient. If money goes to a welfare recipient, it doesn't come with an equivalent tax penalty. There's an aggregate requirement to repay tax, but the money received by the recipient does not come with a liability for the recipient, which is very different to the situation for bank-created money. So what the Stability and Growth Pact has as an objective is to make this negative. That's therefore destroying money. Now, it's a little wonder that Europe is still in the aggregate in a depression, whereas the rest of the world that went through the financial crisis back in 2008, though it hasn't escaped the trap it got itself into, is at least not in a depression. So why this nonsense even happening? It's because fundamentally the theory of economics that dominates the profession, neoclassical theory, has a childish model of lending, which they call loanable funds. And that's the only way to describe it. It's a childish model. It's as accurate a model of money as the model of the Earth-centric model of the universe is. The Earth-centric model derived from the observation that we see the sun orbiting the Earth, therefore the Earth must be the centre of the universe. It's nonsense, and it's about time it was treated that way rather than giving any respect. I also describe it as the Ashley Madison theory of money, because it sees banks as intermediaries, not as originators of loans, but for organisations which simply introduce a saver to a borrower and enable the two to make a transfer of money, and then they charge a fee to make money. That is a childish model. Let's stop treating it with any respect. I call it the Ashley Madison model because, Ashley Madison doesn't actually do this to you, but it introduces you to somebody else who may do that to you, and they charge a fee for the introduction. That's crap. Let's just get rid of it. It doesn't deserve any respect. Now, I'm pleased to say that central banks around the world are starting to say this back to the academic economists who continue maintaining this theory and teaching it in their textbooks, and producing economists who are often running official bodies like the central banks and coming out with this nonsense. But the Bank of England was the first one to say this is nonsense back in 2014. an excellent paper I've linked there. A very simple statement: rather than banks receiving deposits when households save and then lending them out, bank lending creates deposits. Now, I was simply delighted to see even though there's various issues with the technical paper, which I have yet to read properly since it's in German, but the Bundesbank has come out with exactly the same statement just in the last couple of weeks. Banks can create book money just by making an accounting entry. According to the Bundesbank's economist, this is quoting from the press release, which is in English, this refutes a popular misconception that banks act simply as intermediaries at the time of lending. Now, normally when one talks about a popular misconception, we're saying something that amateurs believe that experts know is not true. In this particular case, we're talking about something which often amateurs don't believe, and I'm talking about the general public here that tends to have an understanding or a belief that banks create money when they lend. It's the experts that have got the popular misconception. This is neoclassical theory. This is the money multiplier model of theory of money creation. That's the misconception. So it's actually the theoreticians, the dominant theoreticians, who believe the misconception. The public has a better understanding, and now the central banks, which used to follow what the academic economists generate and then implement that as gospel, they're now saying that gospel is false. So congratulations, and especially, as I said, to the Bundesbank, originally also the Bank of England, and also the Bank of Norway. This is a recent speech by one of the deputy governors of the Bank of Norway saying the bank does not transfer the money from someone else's bank account or from a vault full of money. The money lent to you by the bank has been created by the bank itself out of nothing. This is the adult vision that we need to have. When you have that adult vision, you get a very, very different macroeconomics. And I want to explain why, with again going back to my kingdom of Tom, Dick and Haria. So bank credit, which is the annual change in bank debt, adds to aggregate demand. And I want to simply illustrate why. Well, let's imagine Tom, rather than just taking with the money turning over in his own economy, takes out a loan of €10. I don't show it on the table because there's just not room on the screen, but I can do this in some of my simulations using Minsky. So he takes out a loan from a bank and pays 10% interest on the loan. So it's a €10 loan, so that's going to require interest payments of €1 per year to the bank. And I've now included the bank on the financial flows, but not actually I don't show the asset side of the bank as well. So total expenditure, if that happens, goes from €600 per year to 612. Now, first of all, you have the turnover of existing money, which, as in the previous examples, was €600 per year. But the credit money that has been borrowed has been created by the bank of €10 per year. That is spent by Tom. It's received by Harry, therefore it increases expenditure and it increases income by precisely the same amount. But there's no offsetting decline in that elsewhere because it's not a transfer of money. It's a creation of new money which is then spent by the recipient, adding to aggregate expenditure and aggregate income. Now, then there's also the interest payments that Tom makes to the bank of €1 per year. That is extra expenditure by Tom. It is also extra income by the bank. And just for the sake of simplicity here, I'm not showing the bank accumulating any money. Of course, the bank will normally try to accumulate that money, but I'm showing them spending that €1 per year themselves on Dick and Harry. So you look at the total expenditure has now gone from 600 to 612. Credit impacts macroeconomics. And that is what is left out of conventional economics. It's what I can easily show in my Minsky software. We need a new macroeconomics based on this adult view of how a monetary economy operates, not the childish view of the neoclassical theory, which unfortunately has been codified by the European Union in its so-called Stability and Growth Pact. Now, that pact, because it, as well as being fixated on reducing government debt and trying to force governments to run surpluses, it completely ignored what was happening on private debt. And this is what really caused the crisis in Europe. It allowed an enormous credit bubble to form, predominantly in the southern European countries, which are running trade deficits with Germany. But let's look at Spain in this particular case, because nobody can criticise Spain for not doing the right thing according to the Maastricht Treaty. What I'm showing here in this graph is the 60% of GDP debt level that the Maastricht Treaty set as the maximum amount that it wanted to have governments accumulate, and therefore wanted their own deficits of 3% or less of GDP. That meant that the only country, and this is the case, the only country in Europe that for the duration of the Maastricht Treaty of the euro prior to the crisis actually ran below the Maastricht Treaty limit of 60% of GDP as government debt. The only country to do that was Spain. So if the treaty was correct, this is the right way to manage an economy, it should have been a successful economy. Of course, we know what actually happened. It had a credit crisis, and the credit crisis occurred. We don't know how the credit crisis, we know how it had a crisis. The cause of its crisis has been obscured by not focusing upon private debt. What actually happened, while government debt was falling, the reason it could fall in Spain was there was an enormous bubble in private debt, taking Spain from a debt level of roughly 80% of GDP, private debt of 80% of GDP before the formation of the euro, to 220% of GDP, and then it plunged after that. Now, if you look at the credit, which is change in net private debt per year, what you see is that peaked before the crisis hit at about 40% of GDP. No wonder Spain was booming. But when that plunged, for reasons I explain in my book, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis, when that plunged from plus 20% to minus 20%, plus 40% of GDP to minus 20% of GDP, that's what caused the collapse in the Spanish economy. So rather than being sensible management, the Maastricht Treaty and the Stability and Growth Pact was setting Spain up and the rest of Europe for a financial crisis. Now, the government could run that surplus and cut its debt levels because of the huge stimulus of credit that's ignored by conventional theory but is a reality in a capitalist economy. And it reached, as I said, almost 40% of GDP in 2007, and then it crashed to minus 20%. That's why the economy tanked. So following the Stability and Growth rules to the letter, while doing what the Stability and Growth Pact enabled you to do, which is ignoring what's happening in private credit, led to both the boom and the bust in Spain. And the rising debt after that experience was not a cause of the crisis, it was a symptom. Now, when you then take a look at the relationship between credit and unemployment, you get this type of outrageously strong correlation graph. The correlation coefficient here, anybody who's wondering, is minus 0.94, and that's for the correlation between credit and unemployment from 1986 through to 2016. Now, according to mainstream economics, if you read people like Ben Bernanke, he dismissed the whole importance of debt in the analysis by Irving Fisher of the Great Depression with his debt deflation theory, saying that absent implausibly large differences in propensities to consume, pure redistributions should have no macroeconomic impact. In other words, they're treating credit as a pure redistribution, which is the loanable funds model, saying that banks simply transfer money from a saver to a borrower, not originating loans, which is crap. Okay, the assumption is wrong, but on that assumption, yes, there should be no macroeconomic impact. You look at the data, is the assumption justified? No. Now, this same dynamic applies to every country that in my new book, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis, I call the walking dead of debt, because they're countries that had a debt crisis, most of them in 2008, Japan in 1990, that meant that in the aftermath they're still carrying too much private debt to be able to have any strong demand from credit, and therefore they're like zombies, they're going nowhere. Now, the data for that is available on my website, a new website. I have, as you probably know, a lot of you know, my debtdeflation.com website. For a whole lot of reasons, I think I'm moving from that website to a new one. I got spammed on that website. I have a huge number of unreal subscribers there. It was messed up by a previous person I made a big mistake in making a commercial relationship with, so I'm going to a new clean website I'm calling Prof. Steve Keen. And you'll find data like this one for the United States. As you can see, the US data is very similar to the Spanish data. The bigger the debt level gets to be in the country, the more this correlation between credit and unemployment applies. So, Greece, back to Greece. What had happened in Greece? Greece did not have the same level of private debt explosion as Spain. And of course, it had a high level of government debt right from the very outset if we now look at the data. So you'll see when I run this chart past that Greece had a government debt level exceeding 100% of GDP well before they joined the euro, and it was sustained at that level and then exploded after the crisis hit in 2008. But we have to look at, again, some of the political reasons as to why the European Union itself was willing to turn a blind eye to that debt level, and now they're making a reason to penalise Spain. Outrageous, but that's the situation we're in. So here is Spain's figures on the same front. And you can see, yes, okay, government debt well in excess of the rules of the Maastricht Treaty all the way through, and then exploding after the crisis. But what happened as well, pardon me, I'll go back to that slide. What happened as well was the same increase in private debt, not to the same levels, but the same relative increase from 40% of GDP before the formation of the euro up to levels of 140%. So a whole year's worth of extra GDP spent by the private sector. Now let's see, look, what happened to what's the relationship in Greece between credit and unemployment. Same basic story. When credit falls, unemployment rises. So what the European Union's rules are doing is locking the Greek private sector into permanent deleveraging. When the red line, which is credit, is below the dotted line here, that's when credit is actually negative. So change in credit, change in private debt is actually subtracting from demand and therefore driving unemployment higher. And the apparent recovery in unemployment, which the European Union is spending a lot of time crowing about right now, is largely because that rate of deleveraging has fallen. Not because of any success to the European policies, apart from the fact that the massive cut in wages and the massive cut in costs internally is having some impact on Greece's export. So it's running a surplus, not because it's exporting that much more, but because it simply can't afford to import as much. So here we have the austerity being imposed by the EU is destroying GDP and reducing government debt. But the actual act of doing that is destroying GDP in the process. It's a recipe for a permanent collapse, which is what we're seeing in Greece. And one of the few reasons there's been a recovery in unemployment rate is about 4% of the population has emigrated. Take that out of the figures and you wouldn't be seeing that fall in the unemployment rate to begin with. So we've got the policies of the European Union are keeping Greece in permanent deleveraging as well as taking government money out of circulation. It's a recipe for a disaster. And that's what we're seeing in that country. So it's actually a pact to destroy money. It's not responsible, it's ignorant, it's childish, and it's about time we admitted that. So the answer to how the Greeks can save more money is only if the government creates it, which is prevented by the so-called Stability and Growth Pact, and thus destroying Greece in the process of trying to be responsible children managing a national account. So what we have is a crisis from which the only escape is emigration, and that is one of the reasons we're seeing the European Union falling apart as well, because the failed policies are causing people to emigrate from where the failure is manifest to where there is some benefit from that failure, which partly is Germany, also in countries that were lucky enough not to join the euro but are still in the European Union, such as the UK, which is one of the reasons they voted for Brexit. So here is Godley writing back in 1992, right at the formation of the Maastricht Treaty, predicting what had finally happened in what would have been seen as an outrageous statement at the time it was written, but it's been proved to be completely prophetic. And on the way we're going, my great fear is that the European Union's policies are going to turn Greece into the Somalia of Europe. And if you look again, look at Wynn's brilliant, accurate statement. If a country or region has no power to devalue, and that's what Greece lost by joining the euro, and it is not the beneficiary of a system of fiscal equalisation, jargonistic way of saying if there aren't tax flows from one country to another, as there are tax flows in America from one state to another, because they are genuinely a nation, which Europe is pretending to be but is not, there is nothing to stop it suffering a process of cumulative and terminal decline, leading in the end to emigration as the only alternative for poverty or starvation. And that's the state we're forcing upon Greece. So this is a brutal analogy. Greek austerity is the Irish potato famine of the 21st century, and the Stability and Growth Pact is the potato blight of the 21st century. It's time we rejected that but we also have to reject the bad economics on which it's based. Politicians wouldn't come up with this nonsense, this incredibly destructive set of ideas that they think is responsible, unless economic theory led them into it to some degree. So I'm just showing a little show of my Minsky software here. But what we have in mainstream economics is, first of all, a set of theories that completely ignore money. So the macroeconomic theories do not have money in any deterministic causal sense inside their models. Secondly, they ignore equilibrium, and they ignore private credit as well. So they are nonsense models, nonsense theories of the real world. We can build better models. This is a very simple model in Minsky, which shows the potential for a debt deflation. And I can do much more elaborate models, as those of you who follow my work know. But we need a realistic economics. It's not going to come, unfortunately, out of the university sector, because given the nature of universities and the hierarchical way we rank them, the top universities are dominated by mainstream economic thinkers. People like myself only get positions at low-ranked universities where we don't get security of tenure, we don't get good financing, we don't get the students who are going to necessarily be the ones who become the leaders in future, though there are some very good students who turn up at places like Kingston, particularly in our master's programs. But there's just no way the university sector is going to help, which is why I've gone out to the private sector. So I'll leave that final plug for my Patreon page on the site. I hope that's helped you understand why the Stability and Growth Pact is actually the instability and collapse pact of Europe.